Okay, so
Right.
I've been told that I can start, and I wish to, well, definitely start with a big warm welcome to everyone to this event entitled The UK, Ireland, and the European Union in a Time of Crisis, the Northern Ireland Protocol. So this is one of the first in-person joint seminar of the University Association for Contemporary European Studies and the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies, of which I have now the honor of being the president. My name is Dr. Giada Lagana, and I am a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University, and I will be chairing this event. I am joined on this stage tonight by Dr. Mary C. Murphy from University College Cork. She is author of 3 books and several journal articles looking at the relationship between Northern Ireland and the European Union pre and post-Brexit. Then we have Professor Simon Asherwood, that is Professor of Political and International Studies at the Open University, and he has worked on various aspects of European Union politics for many years, most recently focusing on UK-EU relations and the Brexit process. And the last but definitely not least, we have Shona Murray, that is a journalist with extensive reporting experience covering European and Irish current affairs, as well as international politics and various international humanitarian crises across the globe. So before leaving the space to our amazing speakers, I would like to spend a few words on the organizations that have put this event together, UASIS and IASIS. IASIS is a community of European studies scholars, which has an all-Ireland focus and aims to provide a space for scholars and also practitioners from across the island to share ideas and research connected to the studies of Europe. Part of our ambition is to contribute to discussions on relationships between the European Union and Ireland, North and South. We try to do this in a number of ways, through teaching and research, publishing, and by fostering links between educational institutions, practitioners, and scholars nationally and internationally. We are particularly proud of our relationship that we have now established with our UK national equivalent, UASIS. The University Association for Contemporary European Studies is the global membership of organization for academics, students, and practitioners who are interested in all aspects of Europe and the European Union. The object of the association is to advance education for the public benefit through the promotion of teaching and research in contemporary European studies. And this event has been organized thanks to the Erasmus Plus funding. So tonight, we bring together insights from Ireland, the European Union, and the UK to consider whether the lived experience of the protocol matches the rhetoric, the opinions, and open to the perspective of the various parties involved. And especially we are going to question whether the security of a mutually acceptable outcome might be started to rebuild the UK's relations with Ireland, the European Union, and beyond. And without further ado, I leave the space to our amazing speakers, and I think you are all going to do a quick presentation presenting your perspective, and Mary, I think you are first.
Thank you, Giada, and thanks to IASIS and UASIS for hosting this evening's event. I haven't been in Brussels since 2019, so I'm terribly excited to be here. As Giada mentioned, I've been researching Northern Ireland and the EU for many years, and it was a lot easier pre-Brexit. Those books came easier than the post-Brexit books. And of course, now that we have the protocol, the issues and challenges have been further complicated and multiplied. I'm just going to sketch out some of the main issues, which I think are relevant to the difficulties around the protocol in Northern Ireland specifically. That's what I'll concentrate on. And let me just start by mentioning the broad parameters around the Northern Ireland Protocol in Northern Ireland itself. And the first point to make is that unionism in the round is anti the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's the starting point. Nationalism, on the other hand, is, I would suggest, reluctantly pro the protocol, or at least pro its implementation. And the same is the case for those who classify themselves as others in Northern Ireland, and also that applies to the Irish government as well. The issue has effectively been reduced to a green versus orange issue. So what I mean by that is that the protocol has become entangled with the constitutional question in Northern Ireland, a question which for the most part had been reasonably settled in the context of the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but that has been fractured and interrupted as a consequence of Brexit. So let me just start with unionism and talk about the DUP in particular, which is the largest of Northern Ireland's unionist parties. The DUP wants rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And they're not talking about tinkering with it. They want fundamental change, if not the elimination of the protocol itself. Their objections are based on not just on the requirement for checks at the Irish sea border. They're also objecting to it in the context of regulatory divergence between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. They have concerns about Northern Ireland being subject to EU laws and the impact that has in terms of democratic deficit. And they are clinging to the British government's Northern Ireland Protocol Bill as a means to resolving this issue in the event that that is necessary. Their position is grounded in the Northern Ireland constitutional issue and a visceral fear of the way in which the protocol, in their view, facilitates and propels moves towards Irish unity. Now, of course, that particular interpretation has been refuted and it's been rejected by many in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. And there's an argument to be made as well, perhaps, that by their actions, the DUP may in fact be hastening moves around the Irish unity narrative and the possibility of a border poll itself. So that's the DUP, but the key point there is this can't be, we cannot wish away DUP concerns. They are viscerally felt in Northern Ireland. The other unionist party, the Ulster Unionist Party, the second largest unionist party, is also opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol, but they are very much more in favour of a negotiated settlement and outcome, and that is the emphasis of their contributions to this discussion. There are also more hardline factions in Northern Ireland, within loyalism in particular, which are vehemently opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol as well. They see the Northern Ireland Protocol as an effort to eviscerate the United Kingdom, that union itself. And many of these groups, particularly on the edges of loyalism, are also opposed to the Good Friday Agreement. So that adds another difficulty to the issue. All of the other parties, the SDLP, the nationalist parties, the SDLP and Sinn Féin, as well as the Alliance Party and the Greens, they support the implementation of the protocol, although they do recognise that there does perhaps need to be that there are issues with the implementation of the protocol and that these require a negotiated settlement as well. Now, none of these parties are party to the negotiation process, the UK-EU negotiations. And in addition to that, the absence of an executive since February of this year, I think also has removed any opportunities for cross-party discussions around this particular issue. So that may potentially have eased the way for a resolution, but the fact that those institutions haven't been operational is problematic. So that's the parties. Let me just mention public opinion in Northern Ireland. Now, for this, I want to refer to the work of my colleagues at Queen's University, Katie Hayward and David Finnemore, who've been doing some really important public opinion polling work around the protocol in Northern Ireland. And I suppose their work, a series of opinion polls over the course of the last year or so, they similarly demonstrate the way in which opinion is deeply divided in Northern Ireland and has been reduced to a green versus an orange issue. However, at the level of public opinion, there is a small majority, and this has been consistently the case, a small majority in support of the protocol, in and around 55% for the June 2022 opinion poll. There's also a majority that believe that special arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland in this context. There's a higher majority again that see the protocol as offering potential benefits to Northern Ireland relative to the rest of the UK, if the protocol can be best exploited. But at the same time, there's also a majority which have concerns about the implementation of the protocol. And there are specific issues there around a big issue is customs declarations for parcels that move from GB to Northern Ireland, issues around the movement of seeds and plants from GB to Northern Ireland. And there is also a majority that have concerns about the impact of the protocol and all of the agitation around it on political stability in Northern Ireland itself. And a clear majority, 74%, 74% wish to see a negotiated settlement. So there is no majority support for any sort of unilateral action in the form of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. Among interest groups in Northern Ireland, particularly business, interest groups do not want disruption. And they don't want disruption north-south, nor do they want disruption east-west. For business, there is a clear emphasis on the need for stability, for clarity, for certainty, but also for information. And that's something which they have been lacking. There's frustration with the negotiations amongst these interest groups. And I think a frustration as well with their inability to connect with certain decision makers, particularly within the British government. And there's also concern there about unilateral action by the British government, and that is not something that is welcomed by the business community in Northern Ireland. Let me make two more points before I hand over to my colleagues. I should mention the possibility of an election in Northern Ireland. The 28th of October is a deadline by which the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has advised that he will call a Northern Ireland Assembly election in the event that the institutions aren't resurrected. And he's been very clear about this actually on a number of occasions. Most recently yesterday when he gave evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in Westminster. The date currently being mooted for an election is the 15th of December, just before Christmas. Rather interestingly, that's also the date when we will see a new Taoiseach in Dublin, when Leo Varadkar will take over from Micheál Martin in that rotation situation. And what I would say there is unionists have historically had more difficulties with Leo Varadkar than they have had with Micheál Martin. And we're also unclear, I suppose, about what position Simon Coveney would have in the event of a reshuffle. He's currently Minister for Foreign Affairs. There's little expectation that the DUP will enter the executive before the 28th. But having said that, an election will not necessarily change the DUP's position on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And it's also unclear if an election will have any strong effect on the numbers in terms of the numbers of seats won by parties. So what precisely will change in the event of an election, I think, is very much open to speculation. Now, the calling of an election may be fudged in the event that there are positive signs coming from Brussels about the protocol and its resolution, or in the event that the DUP finds itself in a position to enter the executive. But I think the prospects there are quite slim. In terms of the Irish government, then my last point, Giada, there were talks earlier this week between Taoiseach Micheál Martin and the Northern Ireland political parties in Belfast at what is likely to have been the last time that the current Taoiseach will visit Belfast. The mood music which emerged after those talks was that they were constructive and that they were useful, and that includes, I include the DUP in that particular description. There's been a welcome on the part of the Irish government for recent comments by Steve Baker, the Deputy Secretary of State, in terms of his apology to Ireland. I think that's changed. It's certainly changed the tone of the relationship and the discussions, maybe not the substance, but tone is nevertheless important. We know there are negotiations ongoing in Brussels at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that British-Irish relations have, in the last couple of weeks, they have certainly appeared to have improved, and I suppose that has to be welcomed. But then there's the question of, well, to what extent should the Irish government invest time and effort in developing new relationships with new personnel, whether it's Liz Truss or James Cleverly or Chris Heaton-Harris, in the context of the political instability in Westminster right now. And again, I think that's a reasonable question to ask. And I suppose finally, let me just say that political stability in Westminster really is a necessary backdrop against which the Northern Ireland Protocol issues might be addressed in Brussels and between Dublin and London as well. So just thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, now Simon, I think for a more UK focused perspective.
the light relief of British politics. Thank you, Giada. I think it's always difficult to talk about British politics in this day and age. It's particularly difficult at the moment because I haven't checked my phone in the last 15 minutes. I want to start off with just 3 broad observations about Britain and Brexit generally, and then kind of pull it back to where we are with the Truss administration and what that might mean. The first broad observation is that still in the UK, there is not a consensus about what the point of Brexit is. There was the referendum in 2016, which was a decision, but there wasn't a rationale that was broadly accepted. You know, everyone has an idea, everyone has a project, but there isn't a consensus view, and that makes it very difficult. It means that policy is typically constructed in terms of things we don't like rather than things we do like. And so that's true generally about Brexit. It's particularly true around the protocols, that the various options that are proposed stem from we don't like what we've got and what might be out there. Second observation is that what Brexit policy there is shaped almost completely by domestic party political pressures. So the international ramifications of decisions are secondary concerns. So if we're thinking about the Internal Market Bill, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which disapply or would seek to disapply parts of the protocol, yes, that comes with a huge reputational consequence, but that doesn't matter because it's driven by internal logics within the Conservative Party. So there's relatively low knowledge about how the EU works, about how the Withdrawal Agreement works, about how Northern Ireland works, if we're quite frank, and little interest in self-education. There are outposts of knowledge, but those are relatively rare. And I think that's then really the third point, is that Northern Ireland doesn't matter very much in Westminster. So when we're thinking about UK politics, Northern Ireland is a problem to be dealt with at arm's length rather than an integral part. So if we're thinking about the kind of general logic, that creates real problems. And again, as Mary was saying, you know, the tone from the British government about the absence of an executive in Belfast is one of weary resignation, that here we go again, that there's no real push from Westminster to try and drive that process, or really to engage strongly with interests on the ground, which further complicates the issue. It's one of the reasons why the DUP feels it can push the policy that it does, because it's pushing at an open door in many ways in government. Which brings us to our third post-Brexit Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Let's say something nice about Truss's policy, which is that in a switch from Boris Johnson, we don't seem to have any more this visceral rejection of anything that involves the word Europe. The Johnson's allergy to anything that sounded or looked like doing things with Europeans or the EU seems to have gone. So the warmth of the words that has come through in the last couple of weeks, whether that's in relation to Northern Ireland talks restarting, in relation to Truss attending the European political community in Prague, restarting various kinds of links, all of that is much more presentationally conciliatory rather than the antagonistic rhetoric that was there before with Johnson. However, we have to be clear that none of that has come yet with any shift in policy. So as much as there are exploratory talks around the protocol, it's also been clear that there's been a reaffirmation about government policy as it stands. So whether that's in terms of the command paper that came out last year that sketched out British positions, whether that's about the role of the ECJ, all of these things are still there. And we've had, again, confirmation today from Liz Truss in Parliament that the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill will continue its passage through Parliament. And that clearly is a major source of tension that doubtless we will discuss later. Let's say another nice thing about Liz Truss, which is that at the moment, she's not making the situation any worse in relation to the protocol because she's got other things that she's dealing with. So her economic policy, her political standing has sucked all of the bandwidth out of pretty much any policy other than those two issues. Now that's a double-edged sword, because it's clear that one of the key groups that keeps propped up is the European Research Group. She had a very warm meeting apparently with them yesterday. So it makes it hard to see how she could go down a more conciliatory in substance path and still keep the supporters of the research group, who you have to imagine might waver and question whether this was the right call. So this, I think, leads us to two possible paths for the rest of the Truss administration, however long that might be. I think the first one is that the rhetoric, the shift in presentation might lead to some lessening of issues. We've recently seemed to be getting towards a resolution of the access to real-time data, which has been one of the key problems around the operationalization of the protocol over the last 2 years. The British have taken a long time to get to a system that is acceptable for the EU. But again, this problem that Truss looks like a prime minister with a short shelf life. So is the EU going to want to make many more concessions, or any concessions which might be pocketed by a replacement leader and not actually produce any substantive resolution? The second option, more worryingly, is that Truss might feel that there's nothing less to lose. Things can't get any worse. And that we have a kind of recreation of the end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, for those of you who like your classic movies, that she goes out, guns blazing, fights the fight over the protocol to win some glory, even if she's ultimately doomed. And again, you can see how that might happen, that she might want to just try it, have a roll of the dice to try and win back some support in the party. I think that's it would be a ridiculous thing to do, but I feel that we are beyond ridiculous things being impossible in many ways. I think the only thing that would hold back on that is that clearly something like that, pushing ahead with the protocol bill, would trigger a retaliation of some kind from the EU, and a significant one. And not just directly, but indirectly would cause further market instability. And given the dominance of economic issues and the opinion of the international markets on British politics, that might be the thing that holds her back. That if you're trying to stabilize the pound and British economy, is a trade war or a threat of a trade war really the kind of route you want to go down? And that's my very upbeat assessment of where we are. And I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But we nonetheless really appreciated the efforts to find something positive to say.
Yeah.
Now, Shona, for
Thank you.
what I think it will be a more pragmatic view from outside the
Unfortunately,
islands.
nothing good to say with Liz Truss, though. So just, but I think we got to the limit of it there. But anyway, I think I'd just sketch out the feeling of the protocol here in Brussels. you know, first of all, the deeply contrasting narrative in Brussels versus the UK and Northern Ireland in relation to what the protocol is and what it does and what it's supposed to do. Because here it's really felt like it's a genuine effort and a solution to supporting the Good Friday Agreement, to supporting Ireland, to having better relations with the UK, but also the people of Northern Ireland having access to the EU's single market and the rights and privileges of being EU citizens. And where in the UK, you hear, we heard a lot from David Frost, particularly in his speech in Lisbon a couple of years ago, where he essentially it's seen as keeping the UK within the EU's orbit because the EU just can't let go of the UK and just can't get over Brexit. It really here in Brussels, nobody wants to talk about the protocol. They're very happy to move with what the Commission says in relation to any of the derogations proposed last October. But at the same time, those member states also have concerns about the impact of the single market, about goods eventually find themselves to the continent, and also other issues around level playing field. But the feeling was we need to get this resolved so that we can move on and have a much more prosperous relationship with the UK. And then it moves on to the next point, which is deep frustration that the protocol is constantly used as a reason to have a belligerent relationship with the UK, because in some ways it proves the point from Brexiteers that the EU is trying to keep Northern Ireland within its orbit, but also you know, have some level of control over the sovereignty of the UK. And that's something that is really not the case. People really just don't want to talk about the protocol. They would like to move on. So I think those are some of the issues that are quite prominent here. The other piece is, of course, that on the grand scheme of things, are we really discussing the protocol when there is a war in Ukraine, a violent, brutal war, and the UK and its allies should be working together? And of course they are from a NATO perspective, but the UK has still kept outside very much. I know we saw obviously Liz Truss in Prague at the EPP, or EPC, but at the same time, so far the relationship has been extremely aggressive. Under the change in government and the sort of resumption of discussions, even though people very much in the Commission and the member states that are very supportive of the UK, like the Netherlands and so on, they all said they weren't convinced really at this decision from Liz Truss and James Cleverly and so on to resume negotiations, because I think they felt that politically speaking, they've too far gone, and the type of concessions that the UK will have to make to meet what the EU needs in terms of regulatory support, that she won't be able to do politically. And I think that political space is probably reduced again, given her discussions with the EURG and the fact that, again, she said the protocol bill is still on the table. As one diplomat said to me a few days ago, we can't negotiate when there's a gun on the table, and that's what they're going to expect us to do. So there wasn't, while there was a sort of a welcome to the new tone, and even speaking to people from UCMIS here, like they definitely do try to convince you that a new page is being turned. But speaking to people in the Commission, now that talks have been going on for the last few weeks, they haven't really made any progress. The ECJ is still, actually it's not actually being discussed, because obviously you try to get to talk about the things that you can improve on and you can possibly meet each other on. The ECJ is not there. The customs checks and so on. The feeling from the Commission was, we welcome the tone, but do they realize how far they're going to have to move to actually make an agreement possible? And I think overall, then we hear a lot from Brexiteers saying this schadenfreude here in Brussels, and there really isn't. People would like to see the UK return to being a partner, a European partner, and they don't see that happening anytime soon, particularly with this government. So I think the relationship, the bad relationship, has really left its mark. And if you look back on the past few years, even throughout the negotiations around the vaccines, how hostile that came about, other elements, the fishing wars with France, where Boris Johnson was going to send gunboats over a few fish. I know it's a really important issue, but like we're now talking about a war type situation, and you still have this British government talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. All of these things ultimately are seen as not insurmountable, and that there is a deal to be done for the greater good of people of Northern Ireland and for relations, but the British government don't want to do that. And that's seen as something really regrettable and also really quite sad as well, because Maros Sefcovic has said it so many times, you know, ultimately if the ECJ isn't there in some form, but then Northern Ireland could lose its access to the single market. And that's not good for anyone either. And of course, then you have the implications for Ireland, a member of the EU, very, very supportive member and constructive member, who may have checks on goods coming into the single market if the protocol bill is realised. And that's taking away the sovereignty of a country that had no say in any of this and has done nothing but try to actually support the UK in all of this, but has been met with hostility. So I think the other point that you're making sounds interesting about whether or not the EU should move somewhat or not, depending on whether there'll be a new prime minister. That's one way of looking at it, but also I think everybody would like to get this off their desks at the same time and just have some sort of solution that is in some way immovable. But at the same time, as somebody else said to me, a diplomat, we've been here before with the UK. I mean, the withdrawal agreement was signed and wasn't even implemented. There's no willingness to trust the UK. And the only thing the EU is doing now is, of course, preventing Britain and British scientists and researchers from getting access to Horizon, which is extremely detrimental. But after that, there is a suspension of the TCA in the table, and perhaps that would maybe change the mind of Liz Truss. But the point is, we're not really anywhere further, despite the sort of goodwill we've seen in the past few weeks.
Thank you so much to all the three of our speakers. Now, I'm very happy to abuse my role as a chair, but we are more than happy to take your questions. That's also why we are here to discuss with you. So does anyone has a burning question just to start with? Yes, you are going to be given a microphone, Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers. Peter Boyle, UK Mission to the European Union. Two parts to what's speaking tonight in a private capacity. Two parts to kind of my comments to a question. Now, the first is a reassurance to Professor Usherwood that, you know, not having access to his phone unfortunately means that you've missed the announcement of Suella Braverman's resignation. However, returning to the discussion at hand, I'm curious, and yes, yeah. I didn't come here for fake news. So I'd just like to ask the panel as a whole, and I'd like to hear from anyone on this. Do you feel that the question of identity vis-a-vis the Good Friday Agreement, vis-a-vis that component of British-Irish relations and internal Northern Ireland dynamics, do you think that was sufficiently understood in Brussels? And was that something that was given due weight in negotiations around the protocol and indeed the exit process as a whole? As you possibly picked up, I'm a Northern Ireland native, so I'm always curious how people perceive us abroad.
I would say yes. And actually, one of the things that I think is quite remarkable and encouraging is the level of understanding from member states that don't have the same consciousness about Northern Ireland as obviously UK or Irish people have. I mean, people in Germany, in Poland, and so on, supporting the protocol, but also upholding the Good Friday Agreement, which is why, I mean, the fact that you have EU ambassadors talking about identity goods to ensure that sausages can get across the border and they have to be British sausages, you know, on the grand scheme of things, you know, that can be a bit ridiculous, you know, to a certain extent, but that wasn't treated with any derision. It was seen as something that is really sensitive and that those sensitivities need to be supported. And so I think that actually, definitely, I mean, even in the European Parliament, the Brexit Steering Committee, the various other committees, the people like Guy Verhofstadt or Philippe Lambert from Belgium, I mean, having a conversation with them about the backstop as it was in the earlier days, or the Good Friday Agreement, the negotiation guidelines before the Withdrawal Agreement, they were completely well versed, and many of them visited the border themselves. Now, on the invitation of the Irish government, because, you know, they were there as European Union members. So yes, there was probably greater weight given to the Irish perspective, but, you know, them's the breaks. If you're negotiating against the European Union, of course they're going to have their interests at heart, but nonetheless they also knew that just supporting one view was never going to work and isn't going to work, because that's the whole point of a peace agreement, and to uphold that is really important. So I think that even with those derogations that are announced in October, and the fact that member states are willing to go further and further to protect the fragile peace on the island, I actually thought it was quite commendable how much detail those countries, whether it's MEPs, whether it's diplomats, are aware of the situation in Northern Ireland. More so than many in the ERG, I'd actually hasten to add, because I remember Andrew Bridgen thought that he was entitled to an Irish passport by virtue of the Good Friday Agreement. And this is an organization that calls themselves the Research Group. So I mean, I find some of the lack of knowledge in the UK about certain things relating to Northern Ireland actually quite odd. I remember one time, the Telegraph had a front page story a couple of years ago, which said that Theresa May was going to unilaterally change the Good Friday Agreement to settle, to sort out this Brexit. Like, I mean, I can't, like, the fact that anyone wrote that or an editor printed it, but that was the actual tone of the conversation, to unilaterally change an international peace treaty for the sake of Brexit. So yeah, anyway, to answer your question, I actually do feel that there was enough weight given to the sensitivities in the North.
Mary?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think in many ways it was the mobilization of the Irish government that was very significant in actually telling the Northern Ireland story. I mean, the effort that was an extraordinary diplomatic effort. And I say that objectively, not just because I'm coming from Ireland. It genuinely was an extraordinary diplomatic effort. The only point I would make, though, is I don't think unionism did itself a whole lot of favors before the referendum, during it, or after it, in terms of telling unionists' story from Northern Ireland. So I do think that most of the key players here in Brussels understand Northern Ireland. And I think they understand it going right back to the 1990s and the rolling out of Peace and Reconciliation Fund, the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, et cetera, et cetera. I think there was extraordinary learning took place at that time. And some of the people who were active at the time included people like Michel Barnier. So that historical knowledge played out 20 odd years later. But having said that, I do think unionism feels it is misunderstood. And I think some of that may be unionists' own fault. But in the round, I think it's fair to say, as Shona says, that issues around identity, they are well understood here.
Simon?
Yeah, and just to complete the logic of what's been said, if there is a gap, it's in the extent to which the British government mainstreams Northern Ireland as an issue within the process. So again, it's that kind of provincialization, literally and metaphorically, that goes on. That the very fact it's in a protocol, that it's somehow separate and apart from the rest of the withdrawal agreement, I think is kind of partly indicative of that kind of logic. So yes, I think the British government, with all due respect, didn't do a good job of articulating the kinds of pressures, partly I think because there isn't that awareness in Westminster that that it's largely farmed out to the Northern Ireland office and Northern Ireland secretary. I think when Chris Heaton-Harris was appointed, I think he tweeted out he was looking forward to going out to Northern Ireland. So
even the country, I think you said it.
Yeah, something like very much like a colonial master going out to deal with a errant territory. So it's really there are structural problems in the way the British political system has worked, which I then think didn't do a service. But again, I'd underline the point that Mary's making, that the Irish government did do an exemplary diplomatic effort, and I think tried to do it in as fair a way as possible. It wasn't a partisan approach. It was driven very much by Irish national interest, but the fact that they recognized it as such in a way that the British didn't recognize it, the fact that really until only after the referendum result was known did people start saying, hang on, this is going to be a problem. reflected very badly on the extent to which the British government was prepared to manage that issue. And, you know, even now, you know, we still have discussions about alternative arrangements and max vac and all the other kind of silly kind of models that aren't really practical because there hasn't really been an understanding of the issues that are involved and the sensitivities that are involved.
Well, the protocol itself, I mean, you know, the DUP begged the Boris Johnson not to sign it because it was so limited and it did require so many checks. And I know people who from what's that disbanded? What's it called again? Dexy. Was that it? What was it? Yeah. Who said that they'd spoken to David Frost during the negotiations of the withdrawal agreement and said, like, you know, with the ECJ, with all of these restrictions, it's going to be extremely difficult. And he said, and I quote from the person, I need to win an election. And they went against the unionists. Please, I mean, I've never seen Sammy Wilson almost cry, you know, in the House of Commons. And don't sign this. You are separating us away, and they signed it. And you even had, look, if you look at even things like Karen Bradley, she was appointed Northern Ireland Secretary. She said she didn't even know that unionists voted the DUP and Nationals vote. That's not okay, actually, to say that, or to have that opinion, if that's going to be your job, if you're going to be that secretary, take that role. And then remember, during the Brexit the referendum, Northern Ireland didn't feature, the Good Friday Agreement didn't feature. It didn't feature throughout any of the negotiations until when David Frost decided to have the internal markets bill. And then they started saying, actually, let's use the Good Friday Agreement as a reason to not actually implement any of this stuff now. And we are where we are.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just add one small point to that? 100% agree with you. Teresa Villiers was the Northern Ireland Secretary of State. She advocated for leave. And Chris Eden-Harris is the 7th Northern Ireland Secretary of State since 2016. So I think that sort of underlines your point about the way in which the Northern Ireland issue really is sidelined and marginalised, and the effects of that are playing out in real time right now.
I know it's not really my role, but I would have a small comment to make on the same question if you, the three of you, agree. And it's very much also to answer the question that has been coming from the audience. I think that we here in Brussels, from the European Union, the European Commission and the Parliament have a great knowledge of everything that has going on in Northern Ireland since the start of the conflict. And because looking at archives and papers that dates even back the 80s, the end of the 70s mostly also, there has been a huge effort to try to historicize the Northern Ireland conflict and to understand what was going on in Northern Ireland, and mostly as a result of lobbying from MEPs with John Hume very much at the forefront, who really wanted in some sense to Europeanize the conflict, to Europeanize the Northern Ireland situation, saying that was an issue of the community and that should be dealt in that sense. So I've done a lot of research and work on that particular point. So that's just why I wanted to come in on that. So sorry, not abusing my role anymore. Is there any other question? Yeah, there are a number there.
Sorry.
We're going to give you a microphone.
Hi, Jenny Ratcliffe, Coventry University. I'm interested that you've all talked slightly differently about that that dynamic of understanding. Mary, you mentioned about the Irish intense diplomatic effort, and then by contrast, the lack of knowledge and awareness in the Westminster side. And now that the UK has exited, there's not the same kind of power and influence for the UK mission here that there used to be. There's not the same reach into the Commission. The knowledge becomes less, the understanding and the connections become less. So where do they go next? What's the solution? How do you improve that knowledge and understanding? So just a simple question from me.
Do you want to take a couple of questions and then answer them in group? I know that there was another question there, so.
Hi, my name is Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open. I just wanted to ask about public polling and how much that is likely to affect Truss's decisions and how much weight she puts behind it. And just to note, a Tony Blair Institute poll the other day that came out that suggests that a lot of people in the UK, a majority, would like a closer relationship with the EU than the one that we have now, and a more pragmatic one. So you know, it should be pushing against an open door, really, to foster that closer relationship in terms of polling and winning voter support. So will that impact, do you think, Prime Minister Truss's decisions?
And do we have anything
We have
coming?
we do have some questions. There's quite a few though, so should I just pick
so
one to start
maybe
with?
take two and then we'll do another
Okay,
round
I'm just going to do them in the
afterwards.
order they've been put in the chat. So I have a question here from Paul O'Dwyer. Where does the panel stand on a choice between an Ireland/continent border and a land border on the island of Ireland? If I've read that in a way that makes sense to everybody. And then another one here. Will resolving the Northern Ireland Protocol blockage require an update of the Good Friday Agreement, similar to the 2006 St Andrews Agreement, to give the DUP the changes they are demanding to the GFA consent rules on constitutional change?
Okay, so there is a lot of food for thought. So who wants to go first on some of these points?
Solutions. There isn't an obvious solution, and I think part of the problem is it's a bit. You remember the constitutional treaty when we had the referendums in the Netherlands and France, and it was voted down. We had a period of reflection, and it was clear that the period of reflection was everyone was waiting for someone to come up with a bright idea. And I'm reminded of that kind of logic here, that there's I think certainly on the British side, that some bright spark is going to come running down a corridor, waving a piece of paper saying, I've got it. And that's not going to happen. I mean, this has been so debated and discussed. You know, we have gone round so many rounds of negotiation. We've explored so many different options that we've got what we've got. I think the best you could hope for is that the issue becomes boringly technical rather than politicized. That, you know, it's interesting, you know, Truss's journey, you can call it that, is not actually being shaped by Brexit. So in that sense, she's not really a Brexit prime minister in that way, you know, that those issues are not there. So it's kind of normalized, which might conceivably create some space for a successor to move. At some point, somebody's going to say, will it all be better when we have a Labour government? No, not particularly, because the Labour government doesn't have bold ideas. And if it does have bold ideas, it's going to be very cautious about putting them into effect because it will worry about the backlash. You know, that this is a backdoor to rejoining will be the kind of framing. So, you know, that's not going to be the solution in the immediate kind of period. So I think we've got a problem here. And on the EU side, I think realistically, they will be very cautious about getting into more entanglements with a country and a government that seems to be somewhat unreliable. So that will take a period of time as well. So I haven't got any great confidence on that. On polling, on public opinion polling, yes, you did see that British public opinion is more disposed to working together. But I sense that that is a very shallow kind of thing. You know, it kind of comes from frustrations with why can't we just get along, rather than deeply informed knowledge about the ins and outs of the practicalities of what it would involve. And as much as there is clearly some appetite for closer relationships, I think the practicalities of it, the way in which it could be then repoliticized and used against whoever's moving, I think puts a big brake on things. You know, yeah, so public opinion is not going to be the driver on this. You know, just as public opinion was not pushing for unfunded tax cuts, you know, doesn't mean the government can't do that. So I don't think that this government is particularly thinking about polling figures, or maybe it is, but not like that. And I'll leave the technical side to someone else, Mary.
Thank you so much.
Well, on the first question about solutions, like if we consider earlier periods in Northern Ireland where there have been difficulties or impasses, it's what's been important in those situations is leadership, and leadership from Britain and Ireland has been critical and has really been the bedrock of Northern Ireland's peace process and their route out of these various different periods of crisis. Now, I know this is a slightly different situation because the EU is in the loop here as well. But I do think that the loss of trust in all of those relationships is very, very problematic. And I'm not saying rebuilding or reconstructing that is in any way straightforward or easy. But I do think it's necessary. If there is not good faith and trust within and amongst those relationships, we're not going anywhere. If you think as well about earlier periods of crisis, choreography is important. Timing is important. Sequencing is important. And what I mean is that you have to provide parties, you have to allow them to prepare their respective communities for what might be possible. But critical in all of that is the necessity for compromise. And that's really critical. And it can't be zero sum. And I think the problem at the moment is that the ERG on the one hand and the DUP on the other hand are so steadfast and set in their positions that the space for compromise is just, it's completely shrunk, if non-existent. And that goes back to the earlier point about there not being, trust in these relationships. So having said all of that, I'm always of the view that if there's a problem in Northern Ireland, it really should be solved by Northern Ireland. And I think throughout the negotiation process around Brexit, Northern Ireland, we've talked about Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland has never really been involved in those discussions. And that's not about capitulating to particular interests or anything like that. It's about acknowledging that for all parties who are subject to this agreement, all of them have issues to differing degrees. So I always hark back to earlier periods of negotiation where those qualities and characteristics are in place, and they have proved to be successful in terms of getting us out of a particular situation. But then when you reflect on some of what we've been saying about Britain's interest in this issue, that's a step back. So there are ways and means, but to actually establish the structures and foundations for pursuing those particular routes that's where we're stuck right now, I think.
Yeah, I think I've totally agree with you, Simon, in that if it could just be technical again, then we would be in a much better place, because a lot of this is technical, particularly when it comes to trade. I mean, we know that the UK's trade relations with the EU is suffering. It obviously needs, and it makes sense to have a better trade with your closest neighbours, the most lucrative trade area in the world. But like the other question is, I mean, is Brexit benefiting? Is there anybody that can say, I mean, if you're a person, you traveling to Spain or France, you can't, if you have a holiday home there, you can only stay there, which is 180 days in most cases. You're losing out in terms of your passport access. Scientists, researchers are losing out to horizon. Everything is much more complicated. So surely people would in their everyday lives prefer to have that stuff resolved, because I mean, the Scottish fishermen who are supposed to benefit from the most, they're losing their livelihoods because of the regulatory checks required, as well as the not just the checks, but also as well the paperwork that needs to be filled out. So surely if this is not insurmountable, if the UK chose to have a closer relationship with the EU. But I just still can't understand why nobody has asked the question, who is Brexit actually benefiting? And yet at the same time, you see day after day in the British right-wing tabloids that somehow Brexit is this, triumphant, exit from from the European Union, that they suddenly have their sovereignty back again. I just can't understand this. So I don't, the other thing is that you need to have leadership to have a proper debate about that. And that is one thing that I find so astonishing. During the hustings, we talked about this earlier, Brexit didn't come up when it came to the debates with the prospective leaders of the Tory party, except for once, I think it was Channel 4, when during the Dover crisis, where people were stuck for days in Dover, and both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, when they were asked, has Dover anything to do with Brexit? It completely does have something to do with Brexit. They both said no, shouted no, emphatically, triumphantly, and then that was it. And like, they just got away with that. You know, that was, but the journal, I think it might have been on Channel 4, they didn't ask for a follow-up to say, well, hold on a minute, but before we didn't have to have our passport stamps. And I think that is what is astonishing me. The level of debate in the UK that's being had is really bad. And Keir Starmer really would need to, I would have thought that there are people in the UK would love to have this debate again and say, well, hold on a minute, maybe we can have a much more constructive relationship, but it doesn't seem that that's ever going to materialize.
Thank you so much. Anything about the border? There was a question about the border.
Yeah. I thought I'd escape. Well, I obviously cannot speak for the Irish government, but you know, the prospects of a hard border on the island of Ireland are, they're pretty much unthinkable. But in the event of a trade war, that does focus the mind, you know. So where does the border go? Does it go around the whole island? I mean, neither of those prospects is in any way appealing. And I'm sure the Irish government doesn't relish the prospect of having to deal with that potential outcome. But EU membership, I mean, when you think about the Irish government's priorities in relation to Brexit, one of the priorities, and there was 4 of them, one of the priorities was that Ireland would remain a member of the European Union, and that its place in the European Union would be constructive. So EU membership for Ireland is, I mean, it's non-negotiable, and being part of the single European market is non-negotiable. Our trade with the rest of the EU is economically more important than our trade with Britain. So I can't answer the question with any degree of clarity, really, but it just other than to hope that particular scenario would never materialize.
Speaking to people, Irish government people in the past, year or so about this, it's one person had said to me, while we're in this sort of stalemate with the protocol, it's not that the checks will end up being imposed on Ireland by the, let's say, the European Commission from the island of Ireland to the continent. Is that one small error of something getting in from the UK, which is not checking goods coming into the UK, a small error, some sort of crop ending up in Denmark, ending up in Spain, and having an impact on agriculture there. And that's what's going to happen. And that's what they fear, that there will be just one small mistake where a good has managed to get its way from the UK into the EU single market, and Ireland will be held responsible because the only thing to do then is to start imposing checks from goods coming from the island of Ireland. And that is obviously very frightening for Ireland, but also from a sovereignty perspective, that's extremely debilitating, that the UK's decision to leave the EU will hamper the island of Ireland and Ireland's sovereignty and ability to make its own decisions. And the awful thing about it is the British government know this, and they know that Ireland is in a bind in that way. And that's obviously made relations between the EU, or so the UK and Ireland, the worst that they've been for some time.
Simon, there was another question that had a more, let's say, constitutional
It
focus.
was about whether the Good Friday Agreement might need to be updated. I think the short answer is right now, that doesn't look like a realistic prospect, because I don't think Ireland or the EU would want to get into a territory of renegotiating treaties, because once you start on doing that, then you reopen the question of, well, if you can change the Good Friday Agreement, then you can change the protocol. And that is a very strongly contraindicated position, I think, because once you start doing that, you open up numerous cans of worms. So I think as much as there might be a case, in some cases, like I say that in theoretical terms, because I don't know the provisions well enough to say that revising the content of the agreement might be helpful, it doesn't look realistic because it carries additional political problems. And I think that's the problem. And again, it kind of comes back to this general issue around trust that, you know, you could manage some of these issues away with what you have if you trusted each other to play play it straight. But because we're not in that situation, there's going to be always this concern. And so you hold on to things that you've got. You've got the Good Friday Agreement, you've got the protocol. They come with obligations and responsibilities that are relatively enforceable, one hopes. And you fall back on the hard law rather than the soft stuff, which at the moment isn't there or isn't there sufficient.
Thank you so much.
I might just, sorry, Giada. There is some appetite for reform of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which is related to recent electoral outcomes and particularly some of the gains made by the Alliance Party. Because the agreement was constructed in the context of a unionist nationalist divide, but that has now changed. You know, we do have a constituency of others, in inverted commas, who profess to be neither unionist nor nationalist, and they are really not accommodated by the structures, the decision-making structures and the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. So it is that constituency which is pushing for some degree of reform. But of course, reforming the institution would require cross-party and all-party dialogue. And there are other constituencies in Northern Ireland that would be completely averse, unionism in particular, to those kinds of reforms and changes. But I think the upcoming 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which is next April, may force minds around this. And if there is an election to happen, and if the numbers, if the Alliance Party does even better again, well, I think there is a legitimacy to their calls then for the institutions to be changed in such a way that they better accommodate this emerging and growing identity in Northern Ireland. So it's but I do agree, it's another destabilizing, potentially destabilizing episode if it is to materialize.
Great. I think we have time for another round of questions. So there is one there. Well, a lot. So I saw that there at first. And
Justus Schönlau, Committee of the Regions. I was wondering, without a deep knowledge of the situation in Northern Ireland, that at some point in the story, the possible return of violence was a big element of the narrative, why we needed to sort this out and so on. So I was just wondering, because you also talked about the lack of attention to Northern Ireland, and obviously a return of violence at some scale would bring back attention, even though it would be the completely wrong kind of attention. But just to get a feeling what you think, how realistic that is in the current situation and what factors play. And as a follow-on from that, none of you mentioned the US, which also was mentioned at some stage as a very important player in this whole game. What has happened to them?
thank you. Emily, in front and then there. Thank you, Emily. I'm sorry. I look so bossy.
Good evening, David Garrihy from European Movement Ireland. I have a question about the involvement of Northern Ireland and what the European Union can do to encourage that. There's nearly one or maybe even over 1 million EU citizens in Northern Ireland who don't have representation and their voice isn't being heard, including in the current discussions. So is there some mechanism or way that the EU and Brussels can reach out to those voices? Michel Barnier and Commissioner Šefčovič have visited Northern Ireland. There's been some ideas around having an unofficial representation at the European Parliament for EU citizens. Is there other ideas about how they could be represented in the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So then there are other two.
Hi, my name's Becky. I work at the UK Mission. Mary, I was interested in your comment there about choreography and the importance of kind of preparing communities and parties if there is an agreement, and just be interested in any other reflections that you would have in terms of if the UK and the EU managed to negotiate something where, I guess, what is the bar for unionism for it being acceptable, and what are the kinds of considerations in terms of how you would sell that deal, I guess, back to Northern Ireland? What would the EU and the UK have to take into account? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe Lefebvre, also keeping channels open. As an update, by the way, Grant Shapps is now Home Secretary. So just keeping the Twitter kind of feed rolling there. My question is maybe a little about what you mentioned at the beginning, Simon, about sort of, and I think all of you touched on it, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has focused the UK and EU quite closely together. How much has this been helpful? Because the two have obviously now worked closer together. There is a clear sign that they must work together on these issues. Or how much has been unhelpful because it's allowed, for example, the Truss government to just push aside Northern Ireland once again. So maybe it links a little bit to the US questions about how much are other factors at play here outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then I think after these rounds of answers, we'll answer to a few questions coming from online. So we do a little bit of balance. Okay. And then you tell me how we are in terms of time. Okay. So
I just thought just a few points on that. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill was introduced in the middle of the war in Ukraine, and so everybody was flabbergasted that again there's this confrontational tone with the EU when allies should be working together. And similarly it happened through COVID as well. Even there was the debacle over the vaccines. The UK, by virtue of its contract with AstraZeneca, there was no vaccines being exported to the EU, but the EU exported 41 million vaccines to the UK. And it was this, everything was seen through the prism of Brexit. There was no interest in cooperation, and the world was falling apart. You know what I mean? There's this crushing pandemic, and now you have this war, and it doesn't appear that the UK government is really making a huge effort, besides Liz Truss turning up at the EPC. But of course she had her friend or foe commentary about Macron. So the feeling is, of course, this would bring the UK back into the fold, but it hasn't really in any meaningful sense, except for working with NATO. On the American front, I think that the UK, I think from an Irish government perspective and also an EU perspective, they're very glad that Joe Biden is in the White House, particularly obviously for Ukraine, but also because of his support for the Good Friday Agreement, and the Good Friday Agreement being one of the most successful foreign policy issues that the US has ever been involved in, and that it's rooted in Northern Ireland and it's bipartisan as an issue. And so I think that has been really helpful, and I think perhaps the UK didn't realize how much support Ireland was going to get from its EU partners, first of all, because we know that throughout the May government and so on, many British diplomats were talking to the Eastern European countries and other countries saying, sideline Ireland, and really trying to separate the member states, a bit like the way Trump did. And similarly, there was a feeling that maybe the US would leave Ireland on its own and forget about the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that the US involvement, remember Carbis Bay G7, the whole of the G7 meeting in the UK was dominated by the protocol at the time. So I think the US has been really important in supporting Ireland, particularly on the trade issue as well. So that's been I think a remarkable part of all of this, and hopefully may eventually lead to Liz Truss doing something on the protocol, but we just don't know about that yet.
thank you so much, Mary.
I think the war in Ukraine is mixed. On the one hand, it has provided an opportunity for rebuilding some lines of cooperation and coordination between the UK and the EU. So it's helped maintain some of those contacts that otherwise were at risk of atrophy. At the same time, I have a slight concern that Truss's model has been, let's do the very pragmatic things, you know, so the EPC is super informal, you know, we do, you know, it's kind of common sense cooperation, you know, we just get on with it and we do that without getting into institutionalized issues. And in some ways that is partly a compensation for non-movement on the protocol. So there is it's not a bypassing of it, but it's perhaps a substitution effect, which can work in the context of some weeks, but you know, as we've seen already, you know, that it doesn't address those longer term issues which need to be addressed and can only be addressed through the institutions of the withdrawal agreement and of the protocol. I think the US has been present and, you know, has made its intent clear, but also has recognized that being too vocal and activist about it risks being kind of a counterproductive move. That if it's, you know, we're back into Obama territory, you know, the UK going to the back of the queue for a trade deal, which backfired terribly because the British, well, does any country like being told what to do by other countries? No. But yeah, it played very badly. So again, I think there's a more careful management. And I think if we get to a second Trump presidency, then yeah, we're going to be in very different territory at that point. And, you know, that break or that limit might not be there, won't be there, or it certainly won't be there in the same form. So I think there is an issue in regard of that. And yeah, just thinking about the role of the EU, again, it's a similar kind of issue that the EU can play a role in representing voices in Northern Ireland, but there's a danger of looking like you are trying to bypass the UK government, that has to be careful about how far that goes and how it tries to bring that in. I think, you know, the effort to try and bring more Northern Irish voices into the process is one that should be supported, has to be supported in the longer term, but that needs to be done with all parties agreeing how you do that. It can't be, you're not doing it, so I'm doing it for you, because I think that just risks inflaming the issue rather than making it any better. I'll stop there.
I'll just start with the question about violence. I mean, I don't think there's any appetite for violence in and around the Northern Ireland Protocol. There were very minor, sorry, there weren't minor episodes. There were episodes of protest in Northern Ireland in loyalist communities, which were very short-lived. So I don't think violence is part of the equation here in terms of dealing with the protocol. On the question of the US, you mentioned Biden, and he's definitely an important figure. But I think if you look beyond that, the US, there is a bipartisan consensus in the US in and around the protocol. It's not just Biden, it's not just the White House, it's Congress as well. It's the Friends of Ireland caucus within Congress. It's the ad hoc committee on the protection of the Good Friday Agreement in Washington, which is a 60-member, pretty high profile grouping of senior individuals drawn from all different parts of society. So there is a bipartisan consensus around the need to protect the Good Friday Agreement. And that's the language it's couched in. You know, it's about protecting the Good Friday Agreement. That being said, many unionists have been infuriated by the US positioning on Brexit in particular. A bit like what you've just said, this idea of interference in a matter where the US has no business. But of course, the US would see itself as being, as having been a guarantor of the Northern Ireland peace process. So it has been a little hands-off, but when you look in detail at what's been happening on the ground in Washington, it's a bipartisan consensus, which hasn't necessarily produced the same sort of bipartisan effect in Northern Ireland itself. On the question of choreography then and timing and sequencing, I think an important starting point is to understand how vulnerable unionism is in Northern Ireland, and how, with the greatest of respect to my unionist friends, how insecure unionism feels, and to appreciate the extent to which unionism has been betrayed by the British government down through the years. So there's a vulnerability there that's impacting on how unionism engages with this process. Having said that, involving unionism, I think, is one means of bypassing some of those insecurities and vulnerabilities. Imposing agreements on Northern Ireland, I think that's undesirable, and I think in some cases it's unworkable, because if the players are involved in the discussion and the negotiation, they have a degree of ownership of the outcome of that negotiation, and they have a stake in implementing it. And again, that's the kind of choreography that we've seen, as I said, at various different episodes, most specifically in the context of the peace process and negotiations in the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement. If you think back to Theresa May and her original backstop idea, do you remember? She brought it to Brussels, and unionists were completely taken aback. They had had no sight nor sound of this agreement. To me, that demonstrated a degree of, like, a serious misunderstanding about how you have to be sensitive to the various different constituencies in Northern Ireland. So I think quiet discussions and sensitivity and involvement are very important ways in which those particular interests can be dealt with.
But the thing is, and I totally agree with you there, and I think you're 100% right, but remember, the DUP held the balance of power. They had so much influence. There was the backstop, or not, well, the backstop, but the customs union for all of the UK. There was DUP who supported Brexit, knowing that it would be complicated for the Good Friday Agreement. You know, it felt that they weren't really bringing anything to the table in terms of solutions at any point, other than, really a hard border on the island of Ireland, which is possibly why they wanted Brexit in the first place. So, I mean, it's like, I do have sympathy for them in the way that I can see, if I was a unionist, how I'd be quite terrified, because they had Boris Johnson at their conference, and then how many days later or weeks later he signed off on the protocol, which was far more extreme than the customs union than any of what had been proposed earlier. You know, so they've been let down. You're right. But I mean, Arlene Foster's been here to Brussels many times with Michel Barnier. She's been involved in the negotiations. They never had any solution or any proposal to make it work for anybody. And that was, I think that was really undesirable in terms of their tone. And Barry Andrews had an event here a month or 6 weeks ago where he involves, he had MLAs from a unionist party. The only people who didn't come were the DUP. You know, unfortunately, their level of engagement is quite low.
No, I agree with you. I do agree with you. And the DUP has consistently demonstrated an absence of strategic thinking around Brexit, to put it mildly.
It's a very nice way.
It is, isn't it? Diplomatic. But yeah, what, like, if you're not talking to them, there is a vacuum that opens up, and I think that vacuum can be, you know, potentially risky and dangerous in this scenario. So, but I accept the point, Sean.
But
Yeah.
I think the other point I'd make is it's not just a Northern Ireland issue. It was a structural British problem. That opening phase of negotiations, that period of when Theresa May was putting together her preferences, sketching out the policy before we started the formal negotiations in 2017, was done in a very small circle. So one of the reasons why we had problems about the protocol was that we needed a protocol because it was a consequence of a decision not to be part of the single market or the customs union, which was made by a small group of advisors around May and May herself. So the ramifications of it became apparent rather than being central to the thinking. So again, the very closed nature, the unwillingness to listen to not just civil society or other voices, but also even kind of civil service voices and briefing in that first phase, left us with a starting point that had to then be managed out rather than saying, okay, let's start from some things we want to achieve. And again, it's that point that I started off with, is that we end up with the referendum result. It was like, well, we're leaving, but because we weren't clear about why we were leaving, it was hard to know what it was that was being valued. You know, as well, okay, well, we've got to get out, and then so we just get out, and then how we get out was a kind of a secondary issue. So I think that it's a structural problem that's generated by that bigger problem in UK policy and policy making, which then creates these kind of problems. But it's not to say that there aren't problems in the bottom-up element, but the top-down creation of the situation almost inevitably produced that problem. And I think, you know, it's, well, we're living with the consequences now.
Absolutely. Emily, can we have maybe a selection of 3 questions to round up and then close the event?
Okay, so we have one about regulatory divergence. So what kind of risk does regulatory divergence between the UK and EU pose to the Northern Ireland Protocol in the longer term? And how much awareness is there on both sides of the potential of that risk? And I know there was someone else in the room that had a question. I'm just going to, and sorry, I'll just read one more here from someone who hasn't had a question asked, which was, in my discussions with unionists and loyalists, their greatest fear is always being sold out by the British, who do not even see them as British, in inverted commas. Fear drives this identity and leads to ultimatums and zero-sum politics with the DUP. So sorry, this is more of a comment. Demographics and recent elections just further heighten this sense of isolation. So maybe you have some comments on that. And then I know there's someone here who did.
Dr. Murphy, you said that the views were somewhat fixed, but I just was remembering that moment just before the protocol was being voted on, and if I remember correctly, I remember seeing Marc Francois of the ERG group being interviewed, and he said, well, we're going to vote for it because we're not going to try to be more unionist than unionists themselves. And also at that time, I remember there was an interview with Sir Geoffrey in Northern Ireland, and he was making the point at that time that well, this is a technical border. We're still very much part of the United Kingdom. Sorry, and so I think that was a point where there was a significant majority in the House Parliament. They didn't have that determining role that they had under the May government, and now we have a government that has an 80-seat majority. And so, do you see any room there for some sort of arm locking back to the negotiating table? I mean, you've said that there was leadership in the Good Friday Agreement, but there was also a certain amount of pressure and duress placed on all parties, on all sides, nationalist and unionist, to get to the table and stick to the table and to make a deal. So do you think there's any way that I think general indifference of the British public to Northern Ireland, the huge majority that the Conservative government still have, that there is some sort of force could be exercised to get people around the table and knock out a deal?
Thank you so much. So, Simon, I see you already have your microphone in your hand.
I'm excited to talk about regulatory divergence. It has the potential to be a really major issue. And I think there isn't really an appreciation of the knock-on consequences for the protocol. That the more the UK diverges, the more that will create pressures at borders. So it's not an issue that is sufficiently appreciated in the UK. And again, the progress, the push forward to remove that UK retained law, or to push on regulatory divergence, kind of touching on level playing field issues, has a huge capacity. And I think, again, it's something which is going to be a growing issue. And because it might well be a piecemeal process, certainly on the level playing field side, that you kind of walk into more and more problems that only progressively become apparent rather than the kind of the big bang. I think the retained EU law issue has much more potential for a cliff edge given the deadline at the end of next year. But yeah, we'll do another seminar about that.
And I think also I did an event with Michel Barnier just a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this, but it's not just the impact on the protocol, it's the impact on EU-UK relations, because the non-regressive clause in the TCA, I mean, the French were obviously very concerned about the sewage going into the sea that could impact them. So, and then the level playing field, as we know, which was a huge problem, or sorry, well, contentious negotiation during the TCA talks. So it has a problem there. But when I remember doing some reports in Northern Ireland, speaking to Farmers Union, they would prefer to have something like the protocol protecting their industry from New Zealand lamb or whatever trade agreements that are done to, you know, hastily in order to make Brexit look like a success. And they're concerned about those things, where the protocol would actually protect them because they wouldn't perhaps have access to the Northern Ireland market as well. But you're right, it's one of those things that hasn't been fully realised yet because the UK hasn't diverged too much, which is why Maros Sefcovic said if you sign a temporary SPS agreement and then we'll just sort of deal with the issues down the line, even Joe Biden will give you a trade agreement on that basis. I mean, that's like literally having your cake and eat it. And even then, David Frost was, you know, rejected that. It's really astonishing how unnecessary all of this is when you think about it.
Yeah, I suppose the problem is for unionists that the greater the UK, the greater the degree of divergence between the UK and the rest of the EU, the kind of harder the border becomes at the Irish Sea. And if you're using a unionist lens, that is creating closer links, you know, and convergence between Northern Ireland and the rest of the island. And that then is feeding into, you know, concerns around the prospects of United Ireland. And that's what all of this is that's the lens through which unionism is seeing all of this. And we can dispute it and disagree with it, very reasonably so, but you know, we can't eliminate, you know, it's proving impossible to actually eliminate that very real concern that unionism has.
Which is why you have the dual regulatory idea, which is the EU is never going to support.
Yeah. And then on the is there pressure being exerted? There is a degree of pressure being exerted in the threat of an election, but I'm just not sure that the threat of an election is actually a threat, you know, or that it actually has particular meaning, because it is a threat that unionism in particular is able to bear, you know, to bring on the election. So I'm not terribly optimistic right now about getting people around the table and about getting the Northern Ireland executive resurrected. And I think in a way, until matters in the UK stabilize, I'm not sure that there will be sufficient pressure to force anything in Northern Ireland.
Okay, and I think we have come to the conclusion of this event. We have already overrun a little bit, but I would just ask to our audience to actually join me in a big applause for our